The evidentiary dividing line in the Kennedy assassination has been pretty clear for 40 years. It comes down to one simple argument, one simple disagreement. Did 2 bullets wound President Kennedy and Governor Connally? Or did 3? Almost everybody agrees that there was a missed shot. Almost everyone agrees Oswald couldn't fire 4. So you're left with either 2 bullets doing all the damage, single bullet headshot, or you're left with 3. 3 means conspiracy. Now, you might ask yourself, if you're trying to determine whether 2 or 3 bullets did the damage, what kind of evidence you might use. Well, we've heard a lot about the medical evidence, and some people say that settles the matter. But by its very nature, medical evidence can only talk about the 2 victims individually. It can only tell you how many bullets hit President Kennedy, how many bullets hit Governor Connally. It needs extra information if you want to connect the 2 together. Well, maybe it's photographic evidence. Now, I'm eliminating this for a reason. I am frankly convinced by the kind of argument that you hear from Professor Rohn, that President Kennedy was shot before he went behind the sign and Governor Connally was shot afterwards. But there's a segment of people who have very radical interpretations of eyewitness testimony. And I have to admit that you have to include eyewitness testimony in Professor Rohn's approach to get from A to B. So if I'm going to argue with somebody with that kind of radical interpretation, and Professor Rohn is somebody who thinks very little of eyewitness testimony, I'm going to have to avoid the photographic evidence in part. So then we get to trajectory. And we've heard a lot from ABC. Professor Rohn just put up a slide that showed how the trajectory could work. All of them fail. Every trajectory study fails for the same reason. They connect the dots with bullet wounds. But bullets within bodies can take different trajectories. And because the autopsists didn't bother to dissect President Kennedy's back wound to get an exact path, we can't really know the trajectory within President Kennedy. What limited knowledge we do know suggests that it was going upwards within President Kennedy, meaning he would have to lean over considerably. Now, I don't see him tying his shoes anywhere in the Zapruder film. But apparently Michael Baden does. So I'm going to avoid that for now, and I'm just going to get right down to what we're actually supposed to be discussing today, which is neutron activation analysis. The theory is, and the promise of NAA was, that you can get a firm idea on the number of bullets that did the damage to both men. You irradiate all of your ballistics evidence, you find the chemical profiles of your ballistics fragments, you group them according to their profiles. In theory, the number of groups will tell you how many bullets were fired, and the arrangement within each group will tell you which fragments came from which bullets. I'm going to diagram, well, first let me go through a little bit of the ballistics material very quickly. You've all seen this before. You have the stretcher bullet, you have the front seat limo fragments, you have the bullet fragments allegedly recovered from the president's brain, you have the bullet fragments allegedly recovered from Governor Connally's wrist. And I use allegedly, having heard John Hunt's speech, I don't know how you could have any faith in the integrity of any of this evidence. And then you have the 2 bullet fragments allegedly recovered from under the left jump seat. That should be Q14. That's a typo, sorry. So what does now I'm using the word CBLA. What does the CBLA say? NAA is a technique to get at the chemical profile of material. Henry Lee mentioned another technique last night called ICP. They both fall under the same umbrella of comparative bullet lead analysis. That's the big issue we're talking about, comparative bullet lead analysis. It's abbreviated CBLA. Here you have your ballistics fragments. Dr. Gwynn put them through NAA, and he got exactly what Professor Rohn said he got. He got the stretcher bullet and the wrist fragments in one chemical group, and he got the limo fragments and the alleged brain fragments in another, and he drew the same exact conclusions that Professor Ron was talking about. He said that there were two, and this is important, only two bullets in the groups, that they all came from one rifle. Now, that wasn't Dr. Gwynn, but as Professor Ron says, that follows from this, because you could get the lands and grooves from the two large fragments in each group. And the most controversial aspect, it confirms the single bullet theory. Now, the question you might be asking yourselves is there an alternative way of interpreting the same evidence? Now, there's one alternative way that I'm not going to really discuss, but I think it's perfectly plausible, which is the idea that they took some material from the base of the bullet after they got it, plugged it in, removed the other material in hopes that they would get a match. And the idea that they would plant it after the fact, not before the fact, before they did the analysis. And if you heard John Hunt speak, how can you have any faith in the integrity of the FBI's evidence? They threw evidence out, and they lied about it. But I'm not going to talk much about that. I'm going to assume that the evidence is authentic. I'm going to assume that there's two significant groups, and they're clearly separated. My alternative explanation is one that Professor Ron discussed in passing. It's the one that you might see in the work of, say, physicist Art Snyder. We both agree that this is the way to go. These two separate groups to an analyst would appear as if they are only two groups. In reality, Q9, the fragments at the bottom, are from an entirely different bullet that happens to have the same chemical profile as Q1. The analyst looking at that would see two groups, but in reality, there are only three bullets. Now, you might have two pauses here in your thinking, two obstacles to continuing. One would be logical and one would be scientific. The logical one, in its most extreme form, was expressed in a way by Larry Sturtevant in Professor Ron's article online. I mean, come on, what are the odds that two different people would choose bullets or Mannlicher-Carcano bullets and go ahead and fire at President Kennedy? Well, I spent about 15 years researching and combating the lone assassin theory. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life combating the two lone assassin theory. We're arguing for a conspiracy. Conspiracy implies coordination. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why would they coordinate the kind of ammunition and rifles they're using? Well, you can't control the circumstances in a shooting gallery. And if you use two different kinds of bullets, two different calibers of bullets, on sight, a police officer looking at that would be able to tell that you're dealing with two different rounds. You'd have a manhunt for the grassy knoll assassin. So it's perfectly logical that, that you would have a conspiracy that would coordinate ammunition. Now, the second concept is the scientific one, and that's the one I'm going to be exploring throughout this. You might be asking yourself, okay, you're saying two bullets share the same chemical profile here. What are the odds? That's what I'm going to be exploring. But first, I have to give some pause to consider why we would even think about this alternative. And I'm just going to reiterate what's been said throughout the conference. Mr. and Mrs. Connolly insisted that the governor was struck by a separate round from the president. The Zapruder film suggests both men have been struck at different times. And yes, I know some people think eyewitness testimony is worthless, but I think reasonable people can disagree on that. And then the condition of CE-399, that was brought up by Professor Ron in the previous presentation. My favorite story of the Warren Commission is the story of Dr. Dulce. He was head of the Wound Ballistics Board in 1963. He could argue he was the chief wound ballistics expert in the world at the time. Warren Commission came to him with the actual bullet, CE-399. And they asked him, could this have caused these wounds? And he said, well, I have a big problem with that. The wrist bone we found in the Civil War was the hardest bone to break with bullets. This thing is barely deformed. So they said, well, come on, could you just go ahead and run some tests for us and prove it? Prove it for us? And he said, okay, I'll test it for you. And Dulce came back and said, no, my test actually showed this thing is incredibly unlikely. Can't happen. You can't hit a wrist, break a wrist, and emerge in that condition. And of course, Did he get his way? Did he get in front of the Warren Commission? We only found out the details of what he said over 30 years later when he was interviewed for a documentary. You're wondering why I have a picture of blood up on a screen when I'm talking about comparative bullet lead analysis. Bullet lead isn't very well known to people. It's kind of complex. So I want you to think in terms of blood. Let's say you came to a crime scene and you found a pool of blood, and you were uncertain whether or not 2 or 3 people had left that particular blood. Let's say you looked at blood type and you found A positive and B negative. Could you conclude on that you only had 2 and only 2 people who left blood at that crime scene? No. Because there are dozens of people in this room who share A positive blood. Dozens of people in this room who share B negative. Now let's say you had DNA and you found only 2 kinds of DNA. Well, then everybody would recognize that you have 2 distinct groups, and only 2. Only 2. Because the evidence is actually powerful. Because you know that each person here has a unique DNA type. And so the question becomes, is bullet lead, is Winchester Western bullet lead closer in probative value to DNA or to blood type? Now, I only made this a few weeks ago, and it's already kind of outdated. The 2 people you see up here, one is Dr. Alicia Karikari. She wasn't mentioned in Professor Ron's presentation. The other person, William Tobin, was. Both of them were called before the National Academy of Sciences when they were making their conclusions about how reliable bullet lead is. Karikari is pretty interesting. She was commissioned by the FBI with 2 other Iowa State PhD statisticians to evaluate bullet lead evidence. Now, again, this is kind of dated. Said the scientific basis of the concept is on thin ice. That's from one of the most prominent forensic scientists in the country. Well, it was on thin ice. It has since fallen through the ice and has drowned. And it's for the reasons that are mentioned here. Karikari concluded that at this time, bullet lead evidence has limited probative value. I'm going to get into why. Tobin, Durfelt, McClendon, they all went in front of the National Academy of Sciences, and they said, at most, the most positive opinion you can render is that the bullets could have had a common source. Now, why is this relevant to the Kennedy assassination? I am arguing, remember, that this is another bullet that shared the same profile. They're talking about common sources of bullet lead. Sources could be thousands of bullets that share the same chemical profile. And get a little bit more specific. The metallurgists were looking specifically at the lead as it was shipped to from the people who produce the lead in general. These people produce battery lead. These people produce wheel weights. They produce lead for bullet manufacturers. They're called the secondary refiners. They send their lead over to the bullet producers, Cascade, Federal. And the bullets are then go through a process in which they're made into lead cores and put into bullets, swaged, packaged, and shipped out. I'll get into detail, but what they found challenged the fundamental assumption behind comparative bullet lead analysis. What they found was, contrary to popular understanding, bullet leads made at different times, years apart, weeks apart, batches of lead, thousands of bullets, can share the same profile. Now, the statisticians, there's a specific point in the bullet manufacturing process that they're interested in. They're interested in when bullets are swaged, jacketed, put the jacket on the core, they go into a hopper, and they're packaged. I'm going to go into detail on why that's significant to them. I already discussed this before. Key point is point number 3. The universe of bullets that can share the same chemical profile is potentially very large. This is why it's relevant to the Kennedy assassination. I am arguing that this is a common occurrence. Now, here's an interesting thing. Professor Ron and Dr. Sturtevant used 14 bullets to draw a conclusion about an entire population of 4 million bullets. The Iowa State statisticians commissioned by the FBI to review the probative value of bullet lead analysis had 800 from 4 different manufacturers. They had a background database of 13,000 bullets, a lot more than the 14 that we heard about before. And yet, they couldn't find any kind of statistical test that could help them figure out the key question. How do we know how many bullets share the same profile? How do we know when we connect a fragment to a bullet from another person who committed a crime or allegedly committed a crime? How do we know we haven't made an analytically correct judgment that is empirically wrong? Because somebody else has a box that has the same bullets, or hundreds of people have boxes that have the same bullets. This was the problem they found, and it invalidates every single statistical test you can do. And it's Statistics 101. I wish there were students here. I'd tell them all to go check it out with their professors. In order to get a frame of reference on the entire population of Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, Dr. Gwynn took 4 bullets from one box, 4 bullets from another, 4 from another, and 2 from another. There's only one. He made an assumption, a critical assumption, that is fundamentally wrong. That you could even take those 14 bullets and make an inference to population. You cannot make an inference to population from a non-random sample. If the bullet boxes he were using were not deliberately made to be random samples, and I'll get into this, every single test based on those 14 bullets is wrong. Now, I'm not the only person who's saying that you need a random sample. This was known at the time Gwynn did his tests. This is from American National Standards on how you should sample materials. To estimate properties of a lot, such as the percentage of some constituent or the probable maximum minimum content of some chemical, and I'm going to get into one statistical term. Every part of the pile, in this case it would be every bullet, must have a non-zero chance of selection. That means every bullet must be capable of going into that box. It must have an equal chance of being able to get into that box. That gets to the heart of random sampling. It's the basis of every inference to population you find. If you want to know your poll is accurate, you have to be sure that the sample you're taking from is a random sample. Otherwise, it's invalid. If I went outside during Arlen Specter's presentation and I polled people whether or not they were pro or anti-Warren Commission, I might get a nice result. But the reason they might be out there could be that they just don't want to hear Arlen Specter talk about the single bullet theory again. Those kind of people would be predisposed against the Warren Commission. My sample would be invalid. I didn't carefully select it. It's actually very difficult to achieve a random sample. For it to be applicable in bullets, the manufacturer would have to be either A, very careful to make sure that each box is from a single melt, or B, very careful to draw randomly from all melts when filling the box. But the Iowa State statisticians knew better. They had an FBI report that was talking about the way that bullets are packaged. The FBI concluded that during the process of cutting, swaging, finishing and jacketing bullets, assembling cartridges, and packaging boxlets, bullets from various melts are intermingled. That means bullets from various batches are intermingled. That means bullets could be weighted towards a particular kind of chemical content. It means you could have a bullet box that is predisposed to have a lot of bullets that have 700 to 800 parts per million antimony. And if someone purchased that box and tried to kill a president, they can draw 2 bullets very easily with the same chemical profile without knowing it. To give you an example, a man named Peel did a study of .38 caliber ammunition, and he found as many as 15 different melts in one box. That's 15 different kinds of bullets made on different days that can be distinguished from each other. Okay? So then you say, well, maybe they are very careful about how they put their bullets in the box. There's one problem with that. I called a technician at Winchester Western. At no point during the manufacturing of bullets do they even care to track their melts. So how can they be careful to make sure that all melts are drawn randomly if they don't even know where they are? As an example, in the same Peel study, while he had 3 boxes with as many as 15 melts represented, one had less than half the amount. What's the significance? Well, if somebody like Larry Sturtevant were to take that box and were to analyze 14 bullets from it and determine the distribution, he would have 7 groups that he didn't even know about in the overall population. What does this mean? The claim that you saw was actually 2%, it was 3% a few months ago, that only 3% of the bullet population share a given range of antimony content are entirely unfounded. They run contrary to the accepted understandings of how bullets are made and packaged. You didn't see any, if you read the report by Curricury, you'll see that they tried everything under the sun to try and get a technique, some statistical technique, to try and get at that number, that false positive number, and they couldn't find one because of this. They said they needed more information from the manufacturer. We don't have that information on Mannlicher Carcano bullets. In reality, this figure could be as low as 3%, but could just as easily be as high as 30%. That means 30% chance somebody could draw 2 bullets that match Commission Exhibit 399. That's not good odds. Absent additional information about the entire population of Western 6.5mm rounds, Dr. Gwynn's CBLA evidence and Professor Ron's attempted rehabilitation of it are neither probative nor dispositive. Now, any other case, if you established that the premise behind the science is junk science, you could probably end the story right there. Not in the Kennedy case. We get essentially 3 different arguments to try and support why the stuff done by Randich and Tobin and Professor Curricury don't apply. The first is the general one, and I've sort of debunked it before as I'm talking. I am interested in the number of bullets that can share the same chemical profile as Commission Exhibit 399. The reason why the National Academy of Sciences is going to come out and say that the bullet lead analysis is not probative, the reason why hundreds of people might be getting new trials, some of whom were put there by Vincent P. Gwynn, is because they can't even figure that number out, and it's much higher than they originally thought. So it applies 100% to the Kennedy case. So then we get the one I love. I call it the magic bullet fabrication theory. That is, that magic bullets, poor Oswald, he had the unfortunate luck of picking the only bullets on Earth where you could do comparative bullet lead analysis on. Isn't that a wonderful set of circumstances for the Warren Commission? You get 3 explanations. One is that they're unhardened leads with very low antimony content. The other, they vary widely in content within the same box. And the one that you heard the most in the last presentation was the bullets were made differently using any kind of recycled lead available, and this created the unique vat that created magical bullets capable of avoiding what the National Academy of Sciences is talking about. So, what do we think about the fact that they're unhardened leads? Does that help you get out of the problem? No, because that's the exact kind of leads that Randich and Tobin were looking at. What about the fact that they vary widely in content within the same box? We'll see a little bit about if that's true later. So did the Winchester Western rounds examined by that Peel fellow I talked about earlier, and by the Iowa State statisticians. This has nothing to do with unique fabrication of bullets. This has everything to do with the fact that they're packaged haphazardly. It's why you can't do any statistical study. And then finally, were they made differently using any kind of lead available? Now, this is theoretically possible. Problem is, we wouldn't know as they're going through the process, and we have no primary source to document it, when they're taking any candidate lead, or when they're doing something which many bullet manufacturers do, and just recycling lead cores that were left over. If you recycle lead cores that are left over, that does nothing to your vat. We can't know. And what we have is, in fact, reverse speculation. Start from the premise that I need a unique kind of bullet lead or I can't do this test, and get to the point where I can come up with some theoretical vat that can produce it. Can't do that. We don't have enough bullets to even do it. We don't have a non-random sample to do it. And we have no primary sources to do it. You might ask yourself, does it even matter? In Professor Ron's monograph, when he gets to the point of trying to talk about the kind of bullet that is made from this bullet lead, admits that he doesn't have enough data to do it. But the bigger problem is that the Randich study, Tobin study, calls on principles involved in the melting and mixing of all alloyed metals. Unless this was taken from some meteor on the planet Volker, you're going to have the same principles applied to Mannlicher Carcano bullet lead that apply to any bullet. But they're still not done. They claim that the bullets are similar, but the circumstances are different. Professor Ron went over this sort of in the presentation before. The National Academy of Sciences looked at a very specific kind of usage of comparative bullet lead analysis. They looked at that particular usage for one reason. That's when it's used for in a court of law. But Professor Ron says that because he has good external reasons to think that the bullets group only two, and because the situation is involving connecting fragments at a crime scene to each other and not to a box of bullet leads, that the circumstances don't apply. Well, one thing you'll notice that in this whole entire conversation, you're not hearing from any forensic chemists. Tom, who I worked with, is a chemist, but he's not a forensic chemist. Professor Ron is a chemist. He's not a forensic chemist. I thought, well, maybe forensic chemists actually have to deal with the same kind of problem that Gwynne says and that Ron says changes the circumstances. How do they approach the same problem? How do they count the number of bullets based on the chemical profile? Here is one answer. Even if you find only two groupings of the number of bullets may be higher, the conclusion should be there are at least two bullets. As far as reporting goes, I would say X bullets were recovered from the scene, indicating that at least X shots have been fired at the scene. A forensics materials and analyst can only figure out a minimum number of bullets fired by the suspect at a crime scene. Why? Because they can't eliminate the very thing I'm talking about. The possibility that they're reading a group of two when in reality it's a group of three because another bullet contributed the same fragment. So when they're doing their tests, they're under the same concerns that the National Academy of Sciences were. When they're testing for the number of bullets, it most definitely does apply. In fact, it applied before the National Academy of Sciences even came out with it. That's what actual forensic chemists do when they're confronted with the same problem. But they are right. The circumstances are different. They're worse. Because as the last person who I mentioned to me, the test can only be done when you have 6 elements to evaluate on each bullet. Now, let me explain to you why this is the case. Imagine somebody describing a car that fled a crime scene, and they tell you it's blue. Well, the population of blue cars is enormous. So if you had only a blue car, you would pull somebody over and said, you drove a blue car, good chance you'd be wrong. Well, what if they said that it was a blue Nissan? That population gets a little bit smaller, but it's still not good enough. Let's say it was a blue Nissan 1992. Smaller, still not good enough. Blue Nissan 1992 with 24-inch rims. You get the point. You need more elemental profile, you need more elemental discriminants for the reason why they're called discriminants, to help you narrow your chances of being wrong and help you narrow the chances of making the mistake that I'm talking about. So once again, I said, well, I mentioned this to Professor Ron, and Tom Pinkston mentioned this to Professor Ron, and he said that, well, you have a different set of circumstances again. You're only trying to number the amount of bullets you have, and I'm pretty convinced in my own mind that there are only 2 fragments, so I can focus only on antimony, 1 element. They require 6, they're using 1. So I actually went back to a bunch of NAA experts and forensic chemists, and I asked them, you know, let's say you're only trying to number your fragments, and let's say you're convinced in your own mind that you have 2 groups. Could you use antimony alone to draw your conclusions? Certainly 1 is not enough, especially if it's an alloying element. So far as lowering the bar goes, would you ever lower the bar on your number of discriminants? This is what I'm asking them. If you had circumstances to do so, you really should not do it. 1 element is not enough. Too much is left to chance and serendipity. Measuring just 1 element is a very dangerous concept. I wrote to an Oregon-based NAA expert who's probably going to be having himself dragged into court quite a bit now. And I asked him, this guy is court certified using NAA in a court of law on bullet leads. Now, you might say to yourself, why am I sometimes mentioning people's names and why sometimes I'm not? I just want to give you a clear understanding. When I approach people, I want to make sure that they are not biased on the Kennedy assassination. Who knows, they might have been teaching a class on the Kennedy assassination for 5 years, and that might affect their understanding of the protocol. Eventually, I tell them, but when I tell them, I say, as I'm going to say to you, that if I can use the answers you gave to my questions, I'll point out that you're not commenting on conspiracy or non-conspiracy, and I won't mention your name if you don't give me permission to do so. He never wrote me back about the permission, so I'm not using his name. But to give you an idea of how I asked the question, here I go. You are dealing with several fragments and bullets and want to group them together. This is the situation I'm laying out for him. And you also think you have an idea as to how the bullets and fragments group independently of the chemical analysis. My response to lowering the bar is no. This is my favorite one, and it's not simply because it's the most clear denunciation of the use of 1 element to try and draw conclusions in comparative bullet lead analysis. It's my favorite one because, as far as I know, there's only 1 other person alive, Dr. Gwynn passed away, other than Albert Frasca, who's examined actual Mannlicher Carcano bullet lead. He was a professor emeritus of physics at Wittenberg. He's retired now, and he used to teach classes in NAA. Here's what he has to say about using only 1 element to draw your conclusions. Now, I mentioned that he's the only other person, one of only 2 people I know who are alive who've analyzed Western lead. The other person is the person that Ben mentioned at the beginning of the program, my research partner, Tom Pinkston. We acquired 20 Lot 6000 Mannlicher Carcano bullets, and Tom did something that neither Frasca or Gwynn did. He took lots of tiny little samples from the tip to the base. Now, I could have another entire other presentation about how that tip to base problem raises all sorts of issues. But I just want to focus right now on what happens when we took random selection of those samples, 5 of them. They could be from the same bullet, they might not be from the same bullet, and we applied the test of an analyst. Remember, I'm saying that it's probable or likely, or there's a decent enough chance that somebody looking at 2 groups could in fact see 3. And I was told by forensic chemists that this is the problem that they want to think about when they're trying to number fragments. So here I have actual results from our test. The bottom box over there contains the actual samples, and SB is the symbol for antimony. They are each separate independent fragments. Upper right, that's how the bullets would group if an analyst were to apply the same standards that Gwynn did. Now obviously over on the left, I'm telling you what the analyst would say. Now in this first example, they'd be partially right. They would have gotten the right number, but they would have misgrouped them. In the second example, they're saying that there are only two groups. Remember, Professor Gwynne, Professor Ron would tell you that you're justified in saying two and only two groups. But there are really three bullets. Here we go again. Professor Gwynne and Professor Ron would tell you that you're justified in saying that there were two and only two groups. That's how they would couch their conclusions. But there are three. Once again, two, three, two, but misgrouped. In fact, in the 10 bullets of the 20 that Tom analyzed, only two were analytically indistinguishable or distinguishable from all the others. That means if you would have taken any one from the other 8, you could find at least one other bullet that would match it. At least one. Sometimes 3, sometimes 4. I want to make a caution, though. Tom and I are no less immune to the criticism of non-random samples than Professor Gwynne, Professor Ron, and Dr. Sturtevant. We're only illustrating a point. That box of bullets could have been a box of bullets with 600 parts per million antimony. I know that we're going to come out of this conference and what's going to be said is, well, they were really low and it's really rare to get false matches in this range. Well, why would I even accept the prospect that you're dealing with only one distribution of bullet lead? These vats are made on different days. What if one particular bullet lead vat was misalloyed and just churned out bullets that look like CE-399? You can't say that because you don't have a random sample from which to say it from. So what does this mean? Well, serious questions can be raised about the entire basis and utility of comparative bullet lead analysis as it relates to the Kennedy case. Serious questions could be raised about it everywhere. Kennedy case is no exception. People are going to be getting new trials. Considered in a modern light, Dr. Gwynne's and Dr. Ron's approach flouts convention and protocol in unacceptable ways. They're trying to do more with less. They're trying to reach a stronger conclusion about the number of bullets using less elements. And finally, that Drs. Ron and Sturtevant offer conclusions with little or no probative weight due to the non-random way in which bullets are packaged. No statistical test is valid. That's what the FBI's own statistical experts said, and that's going to be, I predict, because she was called to testify, a major component of why the National Academy of Sciences is ruling against this kind of science. Now, I want to make a little bit of a side note here other than NAA. If NAA were really strong and were really the queen of the evidence, I wouldn't have to sit here and debate all of those circumstances that Professor Ron put up on the board. If it were like DNA, I wouldn't have to be talking about it. If it were like fingerprints, it would be done. It would be over. He could close the case. It's so weak that I'm going to have to waste time talking about external factors that half the people in this audience could probably pick apart because they're straw men. Example, and I'll give you just one. The notion that President Kennedy, it's such a bizarre coincidence that the limousine passed by the book depository. What they're doing is looking at the end result and assuming that's the only result that was planned. I make contingencies when I go out to dinner. If a restaurant isn't open, I go somewhere else. If Kennedy wouldn't have been in Dallas, he might have been shot somewhere else. If it wasn't Oswald who was the patsy, it could have been someone else. Who's to say? You're making an assumption based on the end result. But this is a planned conspiracy. You can't limit it by what you don't know.
This is a question for Dr. Ron. Dr. Ron, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Question for Dr. Ron. Dr. Ron, have you submitted this work for publication? Dr. Ron, have you submitted this work, your work, for publication?
Gary, as I've told you numerous times before, Submission for peer review is a private process. I will comment on it when the time is appropriate, and this is not the appropriate time.
No, it is not confidential that you've submitted a paper for publication. That's not confidential. The results of peer review are generally considered to be confidential matters, but whether you've submitted a paper or not is never a matter of confidence. I tell my residents all the time when I've submitted a paper for publication, that's not a confidential matter. Why are you reluctant to tell us?
Could we, I'm up here to discuss the presentation of this morning.
But my understanding is that in fact you have submitted the paper for publication, and in fact you submitted it a long time ago, and the fact that it's not been published and you're reluctant to talk about it suggests to me that it's been rejected and that you're reluctant to admit that to this audience.
Gary, I don't know. Gary, I'd rather not give the same answer several times to you. Well, I will talk about it when it's appropriate.
Your answer speaks for itself. Thank you very much, Dr. Ron.
Okay, next question. I guess we're just on this side over here.
Good morning, panelists. Thank you for your interesting and compelling presentations this morning. My questions revolve around the setup before the assassination and one ballistics question as well. Regarding the parade route and the circumstances leading up to it, can anyone on the panel either confirm or dispel the allegations of some of the ties to the intelligence community of people associated with Oswald? Specifically, I'm referring to Ruth Payne and her husband, George DeMorenshield, and someone subsequently related to them, Priscilla Johnson McMillan, who did the biography Marina and Lee. And secondly, just regarding the Commission Exhibit 399, the pristine magic bullet, I am now aware that the bullet supposedly, after it passed through President Kennedy, it entered Governor Connally not on a straight line, but rather sideways or broadside. So can someone explain to me, a layman, how a bullet can go through all that soft tissue and then enter Governor Connally broadside, go through, shatter a rib and a wrist bone, end up in his thigh, and yet the only deformity we see on that bullet is on the nose rather than anywhere else on the bullet?
Who's your question for?
Actually, the entire panel, but okay. Dr. Ron, feel free to jump in.
The bullet was damage consistent with having passed through soft tissue at high speed. It was squeezed at its base in the picture that I show. It was also bent somewhat laterally. You cannot see the picture. The first thing it did was pass through basically soft tissue. That slowed it down, that allowed it to, when it subsequently damaged the rib and the wrist, to suffer much less distortion damaging than it would have been the case otherwise. From everything that I have seen, and I had a photo that I didn't show this morning about bullets fired into gelatin at a certain speed, the bending and the bending and squeezing out of the lead at the end is consistent with exactly what happened. I don't think that will satisfy you, but that satisfies me.
I'll let him talk.
Actually, I'm in the process of writing a book on the medical and ballistics aspect of the case. I have about 10 chapters written, approximately about 270 pages, and one of the chapters is called The Diminishing Velocity Theory. And in order for the magic bullet to have caused the damage that it did and remain in its minimally deformed condition, it had to shed kinetic energy in such a manner that as it struck each new piece of tissue or bone, that it was reduced in velocity such that it did not deform more. Larry Sturtevant testified to the House Select Committee in 1978 that the bullet would deform at 1,000 feet per second nose on, 1,400 feet per second nose on, at 1,000 feet per second sideways, if it hit this way, like this. The bullet left the muzzle at 1,200, at about 2,000 feet per second, maybe a little bit more. Lost 100 feet per second on the way to Kennedy, lost 130 feet per second going through Kennedy, and it traveled 60 centimeters to hit Connally. Now, by the time it hit Connally, it was still going somewhere around 1,700 feet per second. And the argument that it was tumbling based on the size of the hole in Governor Connally's back is just it's a false argument, because it is exactly the same size as the hole noted in President Kennedy's head, and I don't hear anybody arguing that the bullet that entered the back of Kennedy's head was tumbling. Shaw corrected himself. Initially, he said it was 3 centimeters. Then he said, no, that was after he debrided the wound, and that's exactly what Dr. Bodden measured in 1979, 2 days before he testified. The debridement. The wound in Governor Connolly's back was about 1.5 centimeters. It was the same size as the president. So if you're going to argue that Governor Connolly sustained a wound from a bullet that was tumbling, then you have to conclude the same thing for the bullet that hit the president in the head. To make a long story short, the FBI conducted tests where they shot a bullet through a goat, and it's markedly deformed.
Okay, we're going to extend this just 5 minutes. We'll just take it from the lunch break. Let's go to this side over here.
Hi, Helen Boylan from Westminster College. My question is for Mr. Wexler. I was wondering, in the original analysis, did they look at any other elements besides lead and antimony? And two questions, sorry. And then when your chemist is doing his analysis, is he looking at other elements, and how many does he need to get, you know, the definitive groups?
One quick question for you. When you say the original analysis, are you talking about the FBI or are you talking about Vincent Gwynn?
Either.
Dr. Gwynn looked at more elements. He got only semi-quantitative data on some of them, which is not good to use. He looked at copper, and we also found the same thing. Copper is all over the map, and he attributed it to contamination, although as an interesting sideline, he had said that if you ever have copper contamination, he said this in one of his articles, it's really a good thing to go look for other elements, and he didn't get the other elements. He looked at silver. The interesting thing about the silver is that he reported 2 separate values for the silver. Before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he gave a value, and if you went just on silver and not antimony, the wrist fragment actually would group more with the fragments from the head than they would from the fragment than the stretcher bullet. A couple years later, when he submitted his stuff for peer review, that value changed, and it became a value that was consistent with a stretcher bullet. Another reason why you have to go with only antimony. And then, so antimony, and Professor Ron agrees, antimony becomes, in the end, in Dr. Gwynn's analysis, the end-all, be-all. I can tell you that we looked at, and Dr. Frasca looked at, over 10 different elements and got quantitative data on them.
Thank you. Let's go back to this side then.
My name is Dennis Haraznak. I'm from Arnold, PA. I have a question for both Dr. Ron and Mr. Wexler. The question of how many bullets, based on the number of sample evidence you have in the limousine, seems to me should be addressed or could be addressed by Bayesian analysis. What is your comment on this? In other words, you are taking statistical information and inferring the source of the data.
Could I make a quick comment?
Please do.
Dr. Arthur Snyder, who's a senior physicist at Stanford Linear Accelerator, proposed exactly that and was never able to convince Professor Ron or Dr. Sturtevant. But it would have been invalid anyway, because I went back to Dr. Snyder. I'm in email communication with him, and I mentioned the conclusions that were drawn by the Iowa State statisticians that bullet boxes are non-random samples, and at that point he said, you can't make any inference to population or any kind of conclusion of the kind that I'm talking about.
Dr. Ron?
I'm going to pass on that. I'm not an expert on Bayesian statistics. Larry Sturtevant is the one of the two of us who worked on the real statistical part. My impression is that he, and I don't mean to speak for him in any way, but that he's neutral to lukewarm on the subject. But that's all I can say, and I don't want to be held to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, back to this side.
Dave Hall from Marquette, Michigan. My question is for Mr. John Hunt. Reference the Harper fragment. Could you please quickly explain where the fragment was found, the size of the fragment, and if it still exists today?
The fragment was found in Dealey Plaza on Saturday after the assassination, and to this day no one's really sure, nobody knows where. About a long period of time passed between the bullet was ejected from Kennedy's head and Harper found it. Any number of things could have moved it from where it landed. So really, even if Harper's recollections that it was, in front of the limousine, and I've never heard any evidence that it was behind the limousine, I've never seen any documentary evidence, it still really is irrelevant because we don't know exactly where he found it. But there was another gentleman named David Burris who found a fragment of bone in Dealey Plaza that was well forward and to the left of the president, and he would be 60 years old today. And I've tried to locate him. David Burris, he lived in Dallas, Texas. He was 21 at the time. And you asked about the fate of the Harper fragment. It went into what I call the Berkeley void. It ended up against receipt with George Berkeley on the 27th after the FBI was done claiming there was no lead on it. The Burris fragment also ended up with Dr. Berkeley on the same receipt in a different typeface. It was done at a different time. And he found a fragment. He turned it over to Studebaker of the Dallas Police Department, and somehow it made its way into Washington. Whether it went to the FBI, I don't know, but to this day, nobody knows where the Harper fragment is.
And the size?
The size, actually, I have a skull over here that has a one-to-one replication of it. It's approximately that big. It's not as large as people think from photographs. About like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
By the way, let me throw out a suggestion. We've got a smaller crowd today. Perhaps we can extend some Q&A also during lunch, okay? But let's just take two more for now. Professor Rohn.
David Rohn from Wisconsin. When Gwynn testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, in the corridor to a Washington Post reporter, he remarked that the material he was examining then in the 70s was different from the material he had examined in 1964, although they were supposed to be the same. Did you find that to be the case? And secondly, when Frazier testified before the Garrison, in the Garrison trial, one of the questions asked was, did he remove a sample from the base of 399? He said he did. What became of that sample? I've never been able to trace that.
Actually, there's a photograph in the archives that I brought with me. I don't have it on the laptop, but it's a photograph of C-399 that I don't think anybody's ever seen before, and it's the as-received condition. And there's a large amount of lead at the base of that bullet that is actually extruded over the side of the bullet, and that, in the official photographs, is gone. What happened to it, I don't know, but I know from I talked with Henry Heiberger, who did the spectrographic analysis for the FBI, and he told me that the size of a sample that they would need for spectrographic analysis, and this is his wording, and this was before, I never mentioned Kennedy assassination, he said it would be the size of a period at the end of a sentence. And I said, well, how much weight in lead do you think that is? And he said it would be about 1 milligram or 2. So the absence of that lead is not explained by spectrographic analysis. There's too much lead missing.
Dr. Thompson.
Josiah Thompson. Question for both Ken Ron and Stu Wexler. Could you each try it and answer either yes or no and then explain your answer? Question is, independent of the dispute over whether the NAA data ends up with the conclusion of 2 or 3 bullets or so, can we know now from NAA that all these fragments mentioned came from 6.5 millimeter Western cartridge Carcano ammunition?
I say yes, as you might expect. Obviously, the little fragments cannot be typed ballistically, but they can be typed chemically, and it is our contention that the groupings, the groupings within each group between the little fragments and the one large fragment that is traced ballistically are sufficiently tight to be sure to any reasonable scientific standard. So I say yes.
I'll say maybe. Dr. Gwynn claimed to have a series of background studies on other ammunition that placed Mannlicher Carcano lead in a specific narrow range that would exclude many other bullet types. There was only about 7% that fell in that range. Given the recent developments, however, I'd love to have somebody go back and do the same kind of test and review it. But nonetheless, the premise, people think that's fatal to the cause of conspiracy. If they're Mannlicher Carcano bullet leads, as I said in my presentation, I think it's perfectly reasonable that you'd coordinate ammunition. I think you'd be pretty bold if you didn't.
Follow-up question. Stu, if somebody asks you, honestly, given the best science we have, using just the chemical data that we have.
I'd say
Can it be limited to just Mannlicher, Carcano, and one others, or where are we on that? I mean, that's a real question.
given the present state of comparative bullet lead analysis, I'd say probably no.
I say yes.
Okay. We're going to have to move on. Okay, I'm sorry. One more question. We got one.
Thank you very much. Just a quick comment. My congratulations to the committee on the planning of the symposium to allow a different point of view that Dr. Rand has presented today, and the committee is to be commended for that one. My quick question, I believe, Mr. Hunt and Dr. Rand, my understanding in the documentation on the drawings on the tumbling bullet that the size of the wound in Connolly's back and the shape is ovid and not the same size as that in the back of President Kennedy's head is my first question. The second question is, did former physicist Luis Alvarez do a study on the relationship between the damage to the bullet and the speed of the bullet? My understanding is he did. Would you care to comment on those two questions?
Let me give you Larry Sturtevant's answer to the first one. It is simply that the bullet hole in Kennedy's back being oval-shaped indicates that the bullet was tumbling or yawing. That means it must have struck something between the muzzle of Oswald's rifle and Connolly's back. It couldn't have struck the tree. They were out from under the tree at that point from the line of sight. Therefore, it must have struck Kennedy. Therefore, that's the true beginning of the single bullet theory, which is now the single bullet factor, what I call a double bullet hit.
And it is oval-shaped, isn't it? It's oval-shaped?
Yeah, oval-shaped because it was yawing.
Yeah. Well, the statement made, Mr. Hunt, was they're both the same size. I just want to be clear on this one. I don't think they are the same size. I measured them.
Who was that for?
Shaw actually did a diagram. He was interviewed for the House Select Committee in 1978. And one of the things they did ask him was whether or not the wound was as large as indicated in his Warren Commission testimony. And he said no, that was an error, that was the debridement. And he did a drawing, a scale 1-to-1 drawing for the House Select Committee. And I ran across that document at the archives. And the dimensions of that wound are virtually identical to the wound as described by the autopsy report and by Dr. Bodden. And the fact, and according to him, it was horizontal in the, it was on a horizontal long angle. And if you can imagine the bullet coming in, if Connolly was turned like this and the bullet strikes him on an angle, it's going to leave an oval wound. It doesn't necessarily have to be tumbling. And Dr. Ron and nobody else knows the condition of the abrasion collar on that wound. If the bullet was tumbling, you would expect to find a different kind of abrasion collar than if it struck on a very extreme angle. So nobody really knows exactly what happened with the bullet that entered.